The Age of Exploration, 1492 to 1607. The period from 1492 to 1607 was a transformative era in world history, often referred to as the Age of Exploration. It marked the beginning of European overseas expansion, exploration, and colonization that reshaped the political, cultural, and economic structures of both the Old and New Worlds. Driven by a thirst for wealth, power, and religious influence, European nations set out on voyages that led to the discovery of new lands, the establishment of colonies, and the beginning of global interconnectedness. However, this era also brought severe consequences for indigenous populations, including disease, enslavement, and cultural displacement. This extended analysis delves into the key events, motivations, players, and impacts of European exploration and colonization during this pivotal time. Motivations for European exploration. The Age of Exploration was driven by a combination of economic, religious, political, and technological factors. These motivations can be summarized as follows. 1.1 Economic aspirations. The search for wealth. European powers sought new trade routes to access the lucrative markets of Asia. Spices, silk, and other luxury goods were in high demand, and controlling trade routes promised immense wealth. Discovery of resources. After reaching the Americas, Europeans realized the land's potential for gold, silver, and agricultural resources like sugar and tobacco. This transformed their focus from trade routes to territorial conquest. 1.2 Religious zeal. The spread of Christianity, particularly Catholicism, was a major goal of European exploration. Spain and Portugal, both Catholic nations, sought to convert indigenous populations to Christianity. Missionaries played a key role in colonization efforts, often accompanying explorers and conquistadors. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in 1517, intensified competition between Catholic and Protestant nations, such as Spain and England, to spread their versions of Christianity. 1. Political rivalries and national prestige. European nations competed for dominance, using exploration and colonization as a means to expand their influence and prestige. Controlling new territories not only brought wealth, but also increased a nation's global standing. Spain and Portugal were the early leaders in exploration, but England, France, and the Netherlands soon joined the race, leading to fierce competition. 1.4 Advances in technology. Innovations in navigation, shipbuilding, and cartography made long-distance voyages possible. The invention of the caravel, improved maps and tools like the astrolabe and compass, allowed explorers to venture farther than ever before. 2. Christopher Columbus and the discovery of the Americas. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, an Italian navigator under Spanish patronage, set sail across the Atlantic Ocean in search of a new route to Asia. Instead, he landed in the Bahamas, believing he had reached the East Indies. Columbus's voyages marked the beginning of sustained European contact with the Americas, often referred to as the New World. Although Columbus's initial goal was trade, his discovery set off a wave of exploration and conquest. Spain quickly established itself as the dominant power in the Americas, claiming vast territories. 3. Major European powers in the Age of Exploration. 3.1 Spain. Spain was the first European nation to capitalize on Columbus's discoveries. Conquistadors and empire building. Spanish conquistadors, such as Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, played a crucial role in expanding Spain's empire. Hernán Cortés, 1519–1521, conquered the Aztec Empire in Mexico, capturing vast amounts of gold and silver. Francisco Pizarro, 1532, overthrew the Inca Empire in Peru, further enriching Spain. Encomienda system. Spain implemented the encomienda system, where indigenous peoples were forced into labor in exchange for supposed protection and religious instruction. This system led to widespread exploitation and suffering. By the mid-16th century, Spain controlled much of South and Central America, the Caribbean, and parts of North America. 3.2 Portugal. Portugal focused its efforts on Africa, Asia, and Brazil, establishing itself as a global maritime power during the Age of Exploration. Its early leadership in exploration was largely due to the vision of Prince Henry the Navigator, who promoted the development of navigation and shipbuilding technologies. Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494. The Treaty of Tordesillas was a pivotal agreement between Spain and Portugal that divided the non-European world along a meridian 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Portugal secured the rights to territories east of this line, which included Africa, Asia, and eventually Brazil. This division enabled Portugal to focus on building a vast overseas empire without interference from Spain. Maritime achievements. Portuguese explorers were at the forefront of discovering sea routes that revolutionized global trade. Vasco da Gama's voyage to India in 1498 opened a direct maritime route to Asia, bypassing the land-based Silk Road. This breakthrough allowed Portugal to dominate the spice trade, exporting highly sought-after commodities like black pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg. Portuguese trading posts, or factories, were established along the West African coast and throughout the Indian Ocean. These posts facilitated trade in gold, ivory, and enslaved Africans. Key locations such as Goa in India, captured in 1510, and Malacca in Southeast Asia became vital hubs in Portugal's global trade network. Colonization of Brazil. In 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral claimed Brazil for Portugal during his expedition to India. Initially, Portuguese efforts in Brazil were limited to the extraction of Brazil wood, a resource used to produce red dye. However, by the mid-16th century, sugarcane plantations became the cornerstone of the Brazilian economy. These plantations relied heavily on enslaved labor, first from indigenous peoples and later from Africans brought through the transatlantic slave trade. Brazil would remain Portugal's most valuable colony, contributing significantly to its wealth and global influence. 3.3 England. England entered the race for exploration and colonization later than Spain and Portugal, largely due to internal political and economic challenges. However, by the late 15th century, English monarchs began sponsoring voyages to assert their presence in the New World. Early exploration. John Cabot, 1497. In 1497, John Cabot, an Italian explorer sponsored by King Henry VII, undertook one of the first English voyages to the Americas. Sailing westward across the Atlantic, Cabot reached the coast of Newfoundland and possibly parts of North America's eastern seaboard. Although his expedition did not establish permanent settlements, it laid the groundwork for England's claims to North America. Jamestown and the beginning of English colonization. The establishment of Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607 marked a major milestone in English colonial history. Funded by the Virginia Company, Jamestown was England's first permanent settlement in the Americas. Initially, the colony faced severe challenges, including harsh winters, food shortages, and conflicts with the indigenous Powhatan Confederacy. The introduction of tobacco cultivation by John Rolfe transformed Jamestown into a profitable venture. Tobacco quickly became a cash crop, fueling the colony's growth and attracting more settlers. To meet the labor demands of tobacco farming, the colony relied on indentured servants and later enslaved Africans. Jamestown's survival demonstrated England's determination to establish a foothold in the New World, paving the way for further colonization. 3.4 France. France's exploration efforts were concentrated on North America, particularly Canada and the Mississippi River region. Unlike Spain and Portugal, France focused more on trade and alliances with indigenous peoples rather than outright conquest. Exploration of the St. Lawrence River. Jacques Cartier, 1534. In 1534, Jacques Cartier explored the St. Lawrence River, claiming the surrounding land for France. Cartier's voyages aimed to find a northwest passage to Asia, but instead they opened up opportunities for trade and settlement. His explorations established French claims to vast territories in what is now Canada. The fur trade and indigenous partnerships. The French economy in the Americas centered around the fur trade, particularly beaver pelts, which were in high demand in Europe. French traders and missionaries developed cooperative relationships with indigenous groups such as the Huron and Algonquin. These alliances were crucial for maintaining access to fur resources and for securing military support against rival European powers. The establishment of settlements like Quebec in 1608 further solidified France's presence in North America. While French colonies were smaller and less populous than those of Spain and England, they played a significant role in shaping the cultural and economic landscape of the region. 4. Impact on indigenous populations. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas marked a catastrophic turning point for indigenous populations. Their societies, which had flourished for centuries, faced unprecedented challenges, including disease, exploitation, and cultural suppression. Steve 4.1 Disease and Depopulation. European contact introduced deadly diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza to the Americas. These diseases were entirely foreign to indigenous populations who had no natural immunity. The result was a demographic catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. Historians estimate that within a century of European arrival, up to 90% of the indigenous population in some regions perished due to epidemics. Diseases often struck indigenous communities even before direct contact with Europeans, as infections spread along trade routes. Entire civilizations, such as the Aztecs in Mexico and the Inca Empire in South America, were decimated by disease outbreaks, weakening their resistance to European conquest. In addition to physical depopulation, the psychological and social impact of these epidemics was profound. Communities that had thrived for generations were left in disarray, with survivors struggling to maintain their cultural traditions amidst overwhelming loss. The drastic decline in population created a power vacuum that Europeans exploited to seize control of lands and resources. 4.2 Exploitation and enslavement. European colonists established systems of forced labor to exploit the wealth of the Americas, often at the expense of indigenous peoples. One of the most infamous systems was the encomienda, implemented primarily in Spanish colonies. Under this system, indigenous peoples were forced to work on plantations and in mines, ostensibly in exchange for protection and religious instruction. In practice, the encomienda system subjected Native Americans to brutal working conditions, starvation, and abuse. Many died as a result of the harsh environment, further exacerbating population declines caused by disease. In addition to forced labor, indigenous peoples were enslaved outright in many regions, particularly in the Caribbean. Others were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands, leading to the collapse of traditional social, political, and economic systems. The exploitation of indigenous labor became a cornerstone of colonial economies, fueling European wealth at a tremendous human cost. 4.3 Cultural displacement. The cultural impact of European colonization was as devastating as its physical effects. European settlers imposed their languages, religions, and customs on indigenous peoples, often forcibly. Christian missionaries played a central role in this cultural displacement, seeking to convert native populations and eradicate traditional spiritual practices. Sacred sites were destroyed, traditional ceremonies were banned, and indigenous leaders were undermined or replaced by colonial authorities. The imposition of European cultural norms led to the loss of countless indigenous traditions, stories, and languages. Despite these challenges, many indigenous communities resisted cultural assimilation. They preserved elements of their heritage, blending them with European influences to create unique hybrid cultures. This resilience ensured that, even in the face of adversity, indigenous identities and traditions would endure. 5. The Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange was one of the most transformative events in global history. This exchange of plants, animals, people, and ideas between the Old World, Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the New World, the Americas, reshaped economies, societies, and environments on both sides of the Atlantic. 5.1 From the Americas to the Old World. The Americas contributed an array of crops that revolutionized Old World diets and agriculture. Staples such as corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and tobacco were introduced to Europe, Asia, and Africa, dramatically altering food systems and economies. Potatoes, for instance, became a dietary staple in countries like Ireland and Russia, fueling population growth and agricultural productivity. Similarly, corn became a vital crop in Africa, supporting livestock and human populations alike. Beyond food, products like tobacco became immensely profitable, driving economic expansion in Europe and the colonies. The introduction of these crops marked the beginning of a global agricultural revolution. 5.2 From the Old World to the Americas. Europeans introduced a variety of animals, crops, and diseases to the Americas, fundamentally altering indigenous ways of life. The arrival of animals such as horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep had a transformative impact on transportation, agriculture, and diets. Horses, in particular, played a pivotal role in reshaping indigenous cultures, especially among the plains tribes of North America, who incorporated them into hunting and warfare practices. The introduction of European crops, including wheat, sugarcane, and coffee, revolutionized agriculture in the Americas. These crops became staples of colonial economies and were primarily grown on plantations using enslaved labor. The cultivation of these cash crops generated immense wealth for European colonists, but came at the cost of human suffering, as it relied heavily on the exploitation of enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples. However, the most devastating transfer from the Old World to the New was disease. Epidemics of smallpox, measles, and other illnesses decimated indigenous populations, killing millions and severely weakening their societies. This biological catastrophe not only reduced resistance to European colonization, but also facilitated the widespread seizure of land and resources. 6. Establishment of permanent colonies, 1607. By the early 17th century, European powers had established permanent colonies in the Americas. These settlements served as administrative, economic, and cultural centers for their respective empires, laying the foundation for European dominance in the New World. 6.1 Spain. Spain's colonial empire was the largest and most powerful in the Americas during this period, encompassing vast territories in South America, Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean. Major cities such as Mexico City, built on the ruins of the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan, and Lima in modern-day Peru, became hubs of Spanish administration, trade, and culture. The Spanish economy relied heavily on the extraction of natural resources, particularly silver, which was exported in massive quantities to Europe and Asia, fueling global trade networks. Spanish colonies were characterized by a rigid social hierarchy. At the top were European settlers, followed by mestizos, people of mixed European and indigenous ancestry, with indigenous peoples occupying the lowest social status. This stratification reflected the deeply entrenched inequalities of colonial society. That's 6.2 England. The establishment of Jamestown, Virginia in 1607 marked the beginning of England's colonial presence in the Americas. This settlement, funded by the Virginia Company, faced numerous challenges in its early years, including food shortages, disease, and conflicts with indigenous peoples. The colony's fortunes changed with the introduction of tobacco cultivation, which became a highly profitable cash crop. Tobacco exports to England generated substantial wealth and attracted more settlers, spurring the expansion of English colonial efforts in North America. To meet the labor demands of tobacco farming, the colony initially relied on indentured servants from Europe. However, as the demand for labor grew, the colony increasingly turned to the use of enslaved Africans, establishing the foundation for the plantation economy that would later dominate the American South. 6.3 France. French colonization in North America differed significantly from that of Spain and England, as it prioritized trade over large-scale settlement. French explorers, such as Samuel de Champlain, established trading posts along the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi Valley. The French economy in the Americas revolved around the fur trade, which relied on partnerships with indigenous groups like the Huron and Algonquin. These alliances were essential for securing access to valuable fur resources and maintaining French influence in the region. Unlike Spanish and English colonies, French settlements were relatively small and focused less on agriculture. However, their emphasis on collaboration with indigenous peoples and the fur trade significantly shaped the cultural and economic development of North America. 7. Legacy of European exploration and colonization. The period from 1492 to 1607 brought profound changes to the world, leaving a complex legacy of both innovation and suffering. The impacts of European exploration and colonization continue to shape global societies, economies, and cultures today. 7.1 Positive impacts. Global exchange. The Columbian Exchange connected the old and new worlds, facilitating the transfer of goods, ideas, and technologies. Economic growth. European nations grew wealthier and more powerful by exploiting colonial resources, fueling the rise of global trade and commerce. Cultural interactions. Although often unequal, interactions between European and Indigenous cultures led to the blending of traditions, shaping the development of modern societies. 7.2 Negative impact. Genocide and displacement. Millions of Indigenous people died due to disease, violence, and exploitation. Entire civilizations were wiped out, and survivors were often displaced from their ancestral lands. Slavery. The transatlantic slave trade subjected millions of Africans to unimaginable suffering, reshaping societies in Africa, the Americas, and Europe. Environmental changes. European agricultural practices and the introduction of non-native species disrupted ecosystems in the Americas, often leading to long-term environmental degradation.